Greetings to everyone on the channel. Friends, today we have an extremely interesting and even somewhat paradoxical topic. We're moving on to a chapter that many chess players habitually consider boring or secondary, but Nimzowitsch turns it into a real art of strategy. We're talking about doubled pawns and restricting mobility. We are taught from childhood, doubled pawns are bad. This is the lameness of the pawn structure, a weakness that must be avoided at all costs. But Nimzowitsch invites us to look at it from a different angle. He teaches us to distinguish between passive weakness and active dynamic strength. You will learn why sometimes it is the doubled pawns that become a reliable foundation for the entire position, and other times they turn into a dead weight, tightly shackling your opponent's pieces. In this issue, we will analyze what are the active and static weaknesses of the pawn structure and how to manipulate them. Why is it sometimes more profitable not to exchange doubled pawns, but to wait for the moment when the opponent himself makes a mistake in trying to correct them? And how to bring the position to a state of complete paralysis of the enemy forces with the help of mysterious moves with a rook and a subtle blockade. Get your boards ready. We're starting to dissect the dynamics of pawn structures. Make yourself comfortable. We're starting. 1. Restriction of mobility when doubled pawns. What is the weakness of doubled pawns? The concept of passive, static, and active, dynamic weakness. In what cases is it advisable to split the enemy's doubled pawns? What is the power of doubled pawns? Limitation of mobility is conceivable even in the absence of doubled pawns, but only in the presence of them is that absolute limitation of mobility possible, which extends over large areas of the chessboard and causes the phenomena of suffocation. What is the disadvantage of doubled pawns? That they can easily be won in the endgame when isolated, or that their possession is at least connected with the unpleasant trouble of defending them, is clear and unexplained, but this is not the end of the problem, for the disadvantage remains even when the pawns are compact, that is, easily defended. We call compact those doubled pawns which are connected with other pawns. The disadvantage of doubled pawns is not fully characterized by the fact that it is more difficult to create a passed pawn. For example, in the position, white pawns a2, b2, c2, c3 against black pawns a7, b7, c7. The main thing is that with the closed advance of doubled pawns, certain paralytic phenomena become possible. After d3, d4, the advance on d4, d5, followed by c3, c4, c5, is slowed down by b7, b6, which would not be the case if there was a white pawn on the b file. With the b2 pawn, instead of c2, a closed pawn mass advance would be possible. d3, d4, d5, then c3, c4, b2, b4, and c4, c5. But since the b2 pawn is missing, an attempt to transfer the attack to the d6 base, see the chapter Pawn Chain, is clearly impracticable. d3, d4, d5, and c3, c4 are followed by b7, b6, and the move c4, c5 is impossible. The noted basic weakness of compact doubled pawns, which we will call active or dynamic weakness, allows us to establish the rule that it is advantageous to achieve the advancement of a pawn mass, the attacking value of which is reduced by the presence of doubled pawns in it. In accordance with this, after the move d3, d4, black should strive to encourage his opponent to move further in the center. As long as the pawn remains on d4, the weaknesses of the doubled pawns are no more noticeable than the lameness of sitting person. Only in the movement do the flaws make themselves felt. Along with active weakness, we must distinguish passive, static weakness. The latter is not found when the doubled pawns move, but, on the contrary, when we attack them with our own pawns. Imagine the previous diagram with a pawn on d5 instead of d3, a white king on g1, and a rook on e2 with the black king on f8 and the rooks on c8. Here the static weakness of the doubled pawns is great. c6, d takes c, rook takes c6. Or c6, c4, c takes d, c takes d, rook c3 followed by ra3. In both cases, black gains an advantage. Let's derive the rule. The static weakness of doubled pawns is exploited by attacking them, and one should not be afraid to break these pawns. The weakness, however, disappears half, but the other half remains. As an example, let us cite a statement from a practical game. An indirect exchange of the d6 and e4 pawns seems expedient for black. How could they try to do this? Black gave his opponent the opportunity to play as he saw fit in the hope that this game would eventually lead to simplification, after which the use of doubled pawns in the endgame would not present much difficulty. Queen d7. In this position, however, black had the opportunity to play actively, because the e3 and e4 pawns are also a static weakness here. I imagine this game as follows. Knight d7. Bishop f3, knight f6, queen c2, c6. Black sacrifices the d6 pawn to conquer the e4 pawn. He kind of exchanges the d6 pawn for e4. After, rook cd1, queen e7. An exchange takes place, and the correct siege of the e3 pawn begins. Queen e1, knight g6, bishop d3, bishop f6, queen f2, bishop e5. Black relies on the strength of the e5 point. Rook c2, rook f8, king h1, b6, queen f3, rook ae8, rook cf2, knight h8, queen h5, c6, g4, f6. And now white succumbed to the temptation to launch a curious attack, which, however, only led to a simplification of the game and revealed all the hopelessness of the e3 and e4 pawn arrangement. They played c5 after, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, d takes c, bishop c4, knight f7, g5, rook e5, rook f5, rook takes f5, e takes f. The gain was achieved by means of king h8, g6 would have followed, and on. Bishop takes f7, queen takes f7, g6. Black would respond. Queen d5 followed by h7, h6. Thus, black's wait-and-see strategy was fully justified. The flank attack was supposed to crash due to counter-maneuvers along the central line, point e5, while the endgame for white is hopeless. This example reveals the dynamic weakness of doubled pawns. Knight h6. So, isolated doubled pawns, as well as compact, advanced doubled pawns, should be attacked with your own pawns. On the contrary, doubled pawns that have not yet advanced should first be made to move. Let them go berserk. Now let us dwell on what constitutes the only true power of doubled pawns. As we have seen, a pawn mass, with doubled pawns in it, contains a certain hidden weakness, which becomes apparent when the pawn mass advances. We have called this weakness dynamic. In contrast, a non-moving pawn mass can be extremely strong due to its stability. If, for example, in the provisions similar to diagram 36, white plays d3, d4, it usually takes a lot of effort to get him to give up his position in the center. What I mean by this is that black hardly has sufficient positional means at his disposal to force white to play dex5 or d4, d5. With the b2 pawn, instead of c2, this is easier to achieve. Stability is determined by doubled pawns. Why this is so is difficult to explain. Perhaps there is some higher law at work here, in which dynamic weakness is compensated by static force. Or maybe it matters that the B file is open, but be that as it may, practice has shown that doubled pawns, c2, c3, favor the stability of the pawn mass. 2. Typical positions with doubled pawns. Doubled pawns as a means of attack. White pawns, a2, c2, c3, d3, e4, or c3, c4 instead of c2, c3. Black, a7, b7, c7, d6, e5. The strongest position for white is the one that occurs after d3, d4. This position must be maintained as long as possible. After d4, d5, the weakness of the doubled pawns becomes apparent. Hence the strategic need for black to achieve the d4, d5 advance. For this purpose, the move c7, c5 should not be used, because after d4, d5 black will be deprived of the opportunity to open the c line with c7, c6, and in addition, the opportunity to occupy the c5 point with the knight. Many chess players make the mistake of immediately attacking the enemy's pawn mass with d6, d5. This is contrary to our rule that doubled pawns must first be forced to advance. In this way, and only in this way, is it possible to reveal the dynamic weakness of the doubled pawns. The examples below are intended to illuminate the struggle between a player defending the stability of the d4 pawn and his opponent seeking to force the movement of that pawn. First of all, we will give an example of how the defender lost all the advantages of his position because of one rash move. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, bishop g5, h6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, e4, bishop b7, knight c3, bishop b4, queen d3, bishop takes c3, b takes c, d6, e6, e5 will soon follow, and the doubled pawn position discussed above arises. Diagrams 36 and 39. Queen e3, knight d7, bishop d3, e5, short castling, a4, a5. Knight e1 white was in a good position, as it seemed unlikely that his opponent would be able to force the d4, d5 advance. However, an unsuccessful move of the knight creates difficulties. It was right. Knight d2 followed by f2, f3. In this case, the queen in an unfortunate position on e3 would be able to retreat to f2, and the d4 pawn would remain stable. Rook ae8, f3, queen e6, and white, in fact, is already forced to play d4, d5. They preferred, however, knight c2 and after, e takes d, c takes d, f5, d5, queen e5, queen d4, knight c5, rook ad1, f takes e, knight takes d3, rook takes d3, queen takes d4. White lost a pawn and the game. The struggle in the following example turned out to be much more difficult. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, e3, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, knight f3, bishop takes c3, b takes c, d6, queen c2, knight bd7, e4, e5, short castling, bishop g5, h6, bishop d2, rook e8, rook ae1. Here black faces a difficult task, to encourage his opponent to operate in the center. They tried to achieve this through the nf6, h7, f8, e6 maneuver. Black fights against the immobility of the d4 pawn on his move. It followed, however, knight h7. But it was also possible. Knight f8 on h3, knight g6, Knight h2 should be rook e7, and if now, f4 then, e takes f, bishop takes f4, queen e8, and white doesn't have a good defense for the e4 pawn. h3, knight hf8, knight h2, knight e6, bishop e3, white persists. c5, for black sees no other way to overcome his opponent's stubbornness. d5, knight f4, bishop e2, knight f8, and black has the opportunity to start a combined attack on both flanks, the c4 pawn and the f4 point. As this example shows, it is sometimes very difficult to force the enemy to carry out the advance we desire. From this, we must naturally conclude that we should double the opponent's pawns only when there is reason to believe that we will succeed in bringing about a weakening advance. The following example is extremely instructive in this regard. After knight f3, d5, b3, c5, e3, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e5, bishop b5, queen d6. White gives up the idea of creating doubled pawns for his opponent immediately by bxc6 bxc6, because it is clear that he will not be able to cause the move d5 d4. On e4, after exchanging on c6, black will hold on to the center passively. White temporarily refused to exchange on c6 and played e4. White had the opportunity to double pawns with bishop takes c6, b takes c, and then play e4, but what would this achieve? What is the way to force the opponent to play d5 d4? Black responded d4, and now, after this advance has been accomplished, the doubling of the enemy's pawns is a desirable goal. Followed knight a3, f6, knight c4, queen d7, queen h5, g6, queen f3, queen c7. If long castling, then knight a5, knight g7, queen takes f6, queen g4, and the action of the queen diagonally on g4 d7 soon led to the fact that black, in order to avoid other troubles, had to put up with doubling pawns. The viewer will find the entire game with detailed notes at the end of the chapter. A chess player who wants to keep his central pawn stable must reckon with the fact that the mobility of his pawn mass with doubled pawns is very limited. In direct correspondence with this circumstance should be the movements of his pieces. They must be insignificant in appearance, subtle in essence, directed simultaneously against both flanks. The following example will explain our idea. After c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, e4, bishop b4, d3, d6, g3, bishop g4, bishop e2, h6, bishop e3, bishop takes c3, b takes c, queen d7. The whites were clearly aware of the dynamic weakness of their doubled pawns. Their plan was to leave the d-pawn stationary on d3, or at least on d4. It is interesting now to follow the movements of the white pieces, adapting to the created pawn configuration in the center. These moves are small and thin, because with an insignificant circulating capital, and the slight mobility of the white pawns corresponds to it, the greatest economy is necessary. Followed by queen c2. If immediately, queen d2, then black plays long castling, and the queen on d2 stands badly. Short castling, queen d2, knight h7, h3, bishop takes h3, knight g1, bishop g4, f3, bishop e6, d4, and white won the piece in the game. If black would have responded to QC2, long castling, then it would follow. We have subjected doubled pawns to a detailed analysis, and in the light of this analysis, some seemingly mundane moments appear before us from a new perspective. The following example: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, bishop b4, short castling, d3, d6, bishop g5, bishop takes c3, b takes c, queen e7, rook e1, knight d8, d4. The attacking position of the white pawns in the center is intended to cover up the dynamic weakness, c2, c3, that becomes apparent after d4, d5. Therefore, this position of the pawns can be called rather defensive. White has an attacking position in the center. This is a current performance. With the b2 pawn instead of the c2 pawn, this would be true, but here the apparently active position of the d4 pawn only seeks to cover its own weakness on c2, c3. After d4, d5, this dynamic weakness would have become apparent. Thus, if you think about it deeper, the c2, c3, d4, e4 pawn formation against e5, d6, c7, b7, a7 is not an attacking position, but a defensive one. Knight e6, bishop c1, c6. That's right. c5, for example. D takes e, d takes e, knight takes e5, knight c7, and so on. Bishop f1, rook d8, g3, queen c7, knight h4. White now wants to play f2, f4. So the initiative in the center still belongs to white. No, the fact is that black did not create difficulties for the enemy on move 11, and white got the opportunity to switch from defense to attack, but at first his position was still defensive. More solid, however. Bishop g2, d5, f4, e takes f. Stronger. Knight takes e4, writes Tartakower. e5, knight e4, g takes f, f5, e takes f, knight takes f6, f5, knight f8, queen f3, and Spielman won the game in brilliant style. Queen f7, bishop d3, bishop d7, bishop f4, rook e8, bishop e5, c5, king h1, c4, bishop e2, bishop c6, queen f4, knight 8 d7, bishop f3, rook e7, rook e2, rook f8, rook g1, queen e8, rook eg2, rook ff7, queen h6, king f8, knight g6, beautiful breakthrough. H takes g, queen h8, knight g8, bishop d6, extremely cramped and tied up in all directions. The opponent can no longer resist an invasion of g8 along the g line. Queen d8, rook takes g6, knight f6, rook takes f6, rook takes f6, rook takes g7. Black resigned. Now let's move on to another type of position with doubled pawns. With such a pawn configuration in the c6 pawn or f6, there is some compensation for the lost center, for this pawn affects the center. The latter is reflected in the fact that white cannot create an outpost on e5. On the other hand, e6, e5 threatens, and finally black can play f6, f5, rg8, and if g2, g3 responds, then h7, h5, f5, f4, and h5, h4. In other words, the passive pawn mass e6, f7, f6 can be deployed and thrown into the attack. The weakness lies in the isolated h7 pawn. To the above diversion, rg8, f6, f5, h7, h5. White usually tries to oppose the following arrangement of pieces: pawns on f4, g3, h2, and knights, if possible, on f3 and g2. In this case, the game is equalized. However, it is very difficult for black to find the right moment to move from defense to attack. We will give a few examples: e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, d takes e, knight takes e4, bishop e7, bishop takes f6, g takes f, knight f3, knight d7, queen d2, rook g8. This move may have waited a little longer. Long castling, knight f8, defends the weak h7 pawn, c4, c6, g3, queen c7, bishop g2, b6, rook e1, bishop b7, king b1. Long castling Paralyzing made excellent use of the internal defensive power of the doubled pawns, and soon the latter turned to attack. Knight c3, king b8. Black uses his compact doubled pawns for defensive purposes. White cannot create an outpost on the e5 square. Queen e3. White is painfully aware of the impossibility of occupying point e5. Knight g6. f6, f5, f4 is already threatening, because e5 is now guarded by the knight. h4, f5, knight e5, finally. f4, queen f3, knight takes e5, d takes e, f takes g, f takes g, bishop b4 with equal play. a3, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, c5, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, rook d6, rook takes d6, e takes d, rook d8, rook d1, queen e4, king a2, rook d7, and a draw on move 30. In this game, Paralyzing, a subtle connoisseur of the game, made excellent use of both the passive and active power of doubled pawns. The next batch is less convincing in this respect. e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, d takes e, bishop takes f6. Next 4 was better at first. G takes f, knight takes e4, f5. The moment for advancement, in my opinion, was poorly chosen. More in line with the position would be the construction of b7, b6, c7, c6, nd7, qc7, bb7, and long castling, as in the previous game. Knight c3, bishop g7. This bishop takes over the defense of the e5 square, but the f6 pawn was a more reliable guard. Knight f3, short castling. On the knight c6, which I have noted as the best sequel, might have followed. Bishop b5, short castling. Bishop takes c6, b takes c, queen d3, rook b8. Long castling, and all of black's attempts to achieve an attack must fail because of the possibility of an invasion on e5, for example. Queen e7, knight e5, queen b4, b3, and so on. Bishop c4, qd2, followed by long castling, should have been preferred. b6. Continuation. Knight c6, knight e2, e5, d takes e. Knight takes e5 would open up diagonals for bishops. For example, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, c3, bishop e6, and black has a good position. It is important for us to note that the move e6, e5, which we talked about earlier, was quite possible here. Queen d3, bishop b7, long castling, knight d7, rook e1, queen f6, king b1, rook fd8, queen e3, c5. It was better. c6 first, to fix the d4 pawn, second, to be able to play b6, b5, and then, on occasion, in b6. The move f5 is therefore not justified by the subsequent development of events. The pawn mass is not turned into an attacking weapon, and even on the contrary, the possibility of moving g2, g4 hangs in the air. d5, e5. G for the game is going astray from the path of accurate calculation. White should be happy to have got the passed pawn, and he should now do something to limit the mobility of the e5 and f5 pawns, such as nd2 and then f2, f3 with a good position. F takes g, knight g5, bishop h6, knight c4, queen g6, f4, e takes f. Queen takes f4 with colossal complications. After a few mistakes made by black, white won on move 44. Here, black's compact doubled pawns did not turn into an attacking weapon. It happened differently in the next game, though with the c7, c6, d6 against e4, c2, and so on, but we consider both of these pawn configurations to be identical in their characteristics. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, d6, d4, bishop d7, short castling, bishop e7, rook e1, e takes d, knight takes d4, short castling, bishop takes c6, b takes c, b3, rook e8. Along with the use of compact doubled pawns, black must also strive to limit the mobility of the enemy center. Bishop b2, bishop f8, queen d3, g6, rook ad1, bishop g7, f3. White abandons the aggressive position in the center, which was achieved by f4, caring more about strength. Queen b8. Black finishes the final preparations for the c6, c5 advance. Bishop c1, queen b6. It was better, as Lasker points out. a5 with a threat, for example. Bishop e3, a4. Knight takes a4, c5. If a4 then, c5, knight db5. Bishop c6 followed by nd7, and a good game for black. 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 Knight a4. Queen b7. Knight b2. c5. Knight e2. Bishop b5. c4. Bishop c6. Knight c3. The a4. b3. c4 pawn configuration in such positions takes away white's chances of winning due to the need to constantly take care of defending the b3 pawn. White's formation is aimed at preventing the advance of a7, a5, a4 without the need for moves that weaken the pawn position. In this case, black also has a weakness, the isolated a7 pawn. Knight d7, bishop e3, knight b6, rook b1, a5. Bishop f2. Now it should have followed. Queen c8. Aggressive use of compact doubled pawns. In this case, white can at least create an outpost on d5. The mutual formation for and against a5, a4 is noteworthy. If knight d5 then, knight takes d5, c takes d, bishop d7 and then a5, a4. White hardly has any other favorable opportunities, except for nd5. Our view is that c6, c5 gives white a d5 point and is in a sense double-edged. But if the necessary prerequisites are met, the e4 pawn is somewhat constrained and nd5 is sufficiently parried, then the c6, c5 advance is warranted. As for white's counterformation in this game, a2, b3, c4 and nb2, and c3. It is very good, but if we take into account the expenditure of effort involved in such a formation, it is clear that it leaves white no chance of winning games played in this way. For example, in the match between Lasker and Schlechter, always ended in a draw. We consider the d6-d5 advance to be bad because it can lead to a significant constraining of the game. In this respect, the following game is very instructive. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5, d6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, bishop d7, short castling, bishop e7, bishop takes c6, b takes c, b3, short castling, bishop b2, d5, e5, knight e8, queen d2, black pawns won't get stronger from advancing, c5, knight to 2, c6, rook ad1, queen c7, knight f4, queen b7 threatened by nxd5, knight a4. This move prepares the blockade on c5. It would be even stronger with the c7, c6, d5 pawns. In this case, the knight on c5 would have paralyzed black's play to a large extent. c4, bishop d4, c takes b, a takes b, cx b3 was more logical. Knight c7, knight d3, knight e6, knight dc5, queen c7, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, queen e3, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, rook b8, knight c5, queen f5, knight d3. White owns c5. However, if they had played cxb3 on move 18, the pressure on the open c-file would have been very strong. Thus, the move d6-d5 can be considered refuted. A student who seeks to understand the inner logic of events will say, how easy it is actually to achieve the blockade of the pawn mass. c7, c6, d5. After all, black managed to split his pawns. In addition, white made an obvious mistake, and yet the mobility of the c6 and d5 pawns was and remains very insignificant. And this is true. The c7, c6, d5 pawns are largely exposed to the danger of blocking. In other words, the connection between doubled pawns and mobility restriction, which we noted at the beginning of the chapter, becomes extremely likely. Another example is the Leonhardt-Nimzowitsch game. In the future, our assumption about the existence of such a connection should turn into a firm certainty. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, e takes d. Surrender of the center. Black tries to further complicate the advance of the e4 pawn. Knight takes d4, bishop e7, bishop e2, short castling, knight c6, knight takes c6, b takes c. The exchange creates certain advantages for both sides. Black gets a more compact pawn mass in the center. The c6 pawn prevents white from creating an outpost with nc3, d5, but, on the other hand, the a7 pawn is isolated, and the c5 point can also become weak, as it happened in the game. b3, d5. Quite possibly. Rook e8 and bf8 play on pawn cg4. Knight e6, rook ad1, rook d8, knight c5. Positional error. White had to make sure that as a result of the exchanges on c5 he had a knight left for the blockade, and as a last resort, if he had to exchange it, then only for a knight. The situation is such that both knights are the main actors, due to their inherent maximum blocking force, and the one who gives the knight for the bishop is at a loss. It was right. Bishop c5. Bishop takes c5. Bishop takes c5. Bishop b7, Rook f3, King f7, Rook h3, King g7, Rook f1, Rook e8, Rook hf3, Rook at 8, Rook d1. Black calmly takes the rook away, since the move. Queen takes a7 impossible due to Rook a8. Queen takes b7. Rook eb8. White cannot do anything substantial. a6, b4, King h8, Queen a3, Rook g8, Queen c3, Rook g7, King h1, Rook dg8. Black is plotting g6 g5, and the knight on e6 renders invaluable services to carry out this plan. The comparison of the blocking pieces, the knight e6 and the bishop c5, turns out to be in favor of the knight in this position. Of course, the bishop does not perform the blockade badly, but in other respects its effect is minimal. Bishop e3. c5. We have already talked about such pawn advances more than once. Sacrificing a pawn is aimed at opening the diagonal to the bishop. One could object to this, but the c6 pawn is neither a passed pawn nor a candidate for passed. This is correct, and yet the c6 pawn is logically full of coursement energy, otherwise white wouldn't have blocked it for so long. In this way, she takes revenge for the embarrassment she has experienced. Rook g3. It was better. B takes c. d4. Rook takes d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3, and white is left with 2 bishops and 2 pawns against 2 rooks, indicated by Schlechter. d4, Queen a3, g5, Bishop c4, g takes f. It was also good. Bishop d5 to preserve the illustrious e6 knight. Bishop takes e6. Bishop takes g2. The bishop was furious. The death of the knight drove him to the point of losing his mind. King g1, but look, he remains alive. This impudent daring. And indeed, after King takes g2, Queen c6, King f1, f takes g, Bishop takes g8, g takes h. The bishop would be worthily avenged. Rook takes g2, Queen c6. Queen takes e6. Whoever wanted to perceive bxg2 check s move solely as a bolt from the blue would only prove that he did not quite understand the logic behind the fury of a bishop deprived of its freedom for a long time. Bishop takes f4. Bishop b7. B takes c. Queen d5. c6. Bishop takes c6. King f2. Rook takes g3. Bishop takes g3. Queen g2. King e1. Bishop f3. Queen takes a6. Queen g1. The whites surrendered. This game confirms the validity of the first reason for the need to block. 3. Limitation of mobility. Mysterious rook moves. Real and imaginary release moves, and how to fight against them. At a time when it was still the order of the day to attack me with united forces to make my ideas look ridiculous, there were some critics who called my rook moves mysterious with subtle derision. e3, d6, f4, e5, f takes e, d takes e, knight c3, bishop d6. The best move. Lasker's thesis that the knights must be brought out first does not cover the essence of the matter. And the essence lies in the pawn configuration and countering the enemy's liberating pawn moves. e4, bishop e6, preventing bf1 c4, knight f3, f6. Black seeks. On move 8, this becomes apparent. To prevent the move d3 d4, which in a certain sense is liberating, because this move reveals white's pawn advantage in the center. Black's play in the end does lead to the paralysis of the central white pawns. However, the question arises, why does Black allow a liberating d2 d4 advance on move 7? d3. White refrains from making a double move with the pawn because d4 would be a typical imaginary release, creating only new weaknesses, for example, knight d7, d5, otherwise, exd4 with a game against an isolated e4 pawn will follow someday. Bishop f7 followed by the capture of c5 by the bishop or knight. Knight e7, bishop e3, c5. Based on the opportunities offered by the open d-file, Black gradually puts his opponent in the defensive position. See Black's 9th and 10th moves. Queen d2, knight bc6, bishop e2, knight d4, short castling, knight d1, knight ec6, c3. Black's systematic operations led to a certain result. The a3 pawn is weak. Knight takes e2, queen takes e2, rook e8. A mysterious move with a rook aimed at using the e-line against the e4 pawn, in the case of d3 d4. In addition, this move frees up the f8 square for the bishop. Knight h4, bishop f8, knight f5, king h8. White uses his only chance, the open f line. Black's move, for all its insignificance, is characteristic of positional play. He provides himself with the opportunity to play on g7 g6 followed by f6 f5, and they eliminate the obstacle, a check on h6. g4, queen d7 to be able to parry the impending advance of g4 g5, knight f2. For example, g5, g6, knight g3, f5, and Black is doing excellently. See previous note. a5. The a2 pawn is under attack and chains the rook to itself. On b2 b3, Black wants to be able to respond with a5, a4. The weakness of White's center thus affected the queen side as well. a3, b5. The move was strong. Bishop b3, but in this case, Black could not parry the g4 g5 threat in the way he had originally intended. Still, they could safely play bb3. You should never become a slave to your desires and intentions. For example, g5, f takes g, bishop takes g5, c4, proposed by Lasker, d takes c, queen e6, knight e3, or queen f3, bishop takes c4, rook fd1, and Black's position is somewhat better. Queen g6, queen g4, bishop c5, and Black wins. Rook ad1, rook ab8. With immediate b5 b4, Black would probably save a few tempo. Rook d2, b4, a takes b, a takes b. If c takes b, then d4, or c4. Rook a8. Black got a strategically advantageous position and now had to take advantage of his position. They should have aimed to play nc6, d4, which leads to bxd4, and then g7 g6 followed by bh6 to dominate diagonally on h6 c1. For example, g6, knight g3, knight d4, bishop takes d4, or queen d1, rook a8 followed by qd7, a4. Black soon forces the exchange of queens and gets a good endgame. C takes d, for example, king g2, bishop h6. However, it was possible to rearrange the moves. For example, Knight d4. Bishop takes d4. C takes d. Queen f3, best. g6. Knight g3. Queen e7. Knight d1. Bishop h6. Rook g2. Bishop g5 with further rb8, a8, a1, and so on. Queen f3. Rook a2. There was still time to play nd4. g5 thanks to an ingenious tactical maneuver. White's 26th move. This seemingly easily parried advance is still possible. Black is in a bad position. g6. Knight g4. Takes away from black the results of all previous work. G takes f. Knight takes f6. Knight d4. Queen f2 qh, 5-1 faster. Queen c6. Knight takes e8. Queen takes e8. Bishop takes d4. E takes d. E takes f, and white won easily. White clearly intends to play d3 d4 at the right moment. The rf8. e8 maneuver is intended to make this release move more difficult. Thus, the matter here comes down to a certain preventive measure. In fact, only the external form of the move is mysterious. The rook occupies a closed line for the time being, but not its strategic goal. Despite this, we will retain the name mysterious, and the irony in this case will no longer refer to the move. Requiring only a direct attacking action from a piece is the level of an average player. A more flexible understanding of the game quite reasonably imposes a requirement for a preventive action on the pieces. The typical state of affairs is as follows. The enemy's planned unleashing maneuver, in most cases a pawn advance, will result in an open line for us as well. This future line, the opening of which is not in our power, we occupy in advance in order to complicate the enemy's release maneuver. The mysterious move of the rook is a necessary part of a reasonable strategy. The widespread opinion that you should choose only the positions of the greatest activity for rooks is a prejudice that must be overcome in yourself. I take the liberty of asserting that the prophylaxis of the opponent's freeing moves is much more important than considerations as to whether the rook is currently active or in a passive position. Now let's give a few examples. In this position, it should be understood as a formation. White plays rf1, d1. They are waiting for the move c6, c5 afterwards and want to use the c and d lines after dxc5 and bxc5 to put pressure against the hanging pawns d5 and c5. The mysterious move with the rook is of the greatest importance in the opening, but it also plays a significant role in the middle game. With ra8, a7, and rf8, a8, black seeks to prevent the advance of a2, a3 followed by b3, b4, and c4, c5, or at least weaken the strength of this advance. Black plays rook a7 if white responds. a3 then. Rook fa8 now white can carry out his plan. b3, b4 followed by c4, c5, only by making certain concessions to his opponent. It could follow queen b2, queen d8, b4, a takes b, a takes b, queen b8, rook fb1. Rook takes a7, queen takes a7, and black owns the a line. King f8, c5, b takes c, rook takes a7, rook takes a7, b takes c, queen takes b2, rook takes b2, rook a3, rook c2, bishop c8, c6. The best, on c takes d, c takes d, knight b5 should be, rook a1, king f2, bishop a6, and the game is approximately equal. Knight e8 followed by f7, f5 with some counterplay. The viewer will find another example in the next game. Having a d5 pawn chain, c4 versus d4, c3 requires attacking the c3 base by a7, a6, b6, b5, a6, a5, and b5, b4. However, you must first secure your position against a possible attack by g2, g4. To this end, Black played h5, Rook f1, Rook h6, a mysterious move with a rook directed against the h2, h3 maneuver followed by g2, g4. If White tries to execute it, then Black's forces will be ready for an attack on the h line. Bishop e1, g6, Bishop h4, King f7, Queen e1, a6. Now it's time to make that move. Bishop a4, b5, Bishop d1, Bishop c6, Rook h3. It would have been more appropriate to take care of protecting the queen side. a5, Bishop g5, Rook h8, Queen h4, b4, Queen e1. If Bishop f6, then Bishop e7, Rook b8, Rook hf3, a4, and Black won by breaking through the queen side. Rook 3 f2, a3, b3, c takes b, Bishop takes b3, Bishop b5, Rook g1, Queen takes c3, and so on. The rf8, f6, h6, h8 maneuver is very plastic and leaves a strong impression. Black wanted to realize pawn supremacy on the king side by kf7, g6, f5, followed by e6, e5. In response to kf7, g6, however, g3, g4 would follow. Therefore, I chose the mysterious move with the rook, so it turns out to be possible even in the endgame. Rook h8 after, Rook d1, King g6, Rook d4, King f5, Bishop d2. Again, the mysterious move followed. Rook f8. In the interests of fairness, however, we shall call the last move semi-mysterious, for unlike the passive, preemptive move rh8, it is a purely active maneuver. The sequel was Bishop e1, e5, f takes e, f takes e, Rook h4, g5, Rook b4, King e6, King e2, e4, Bishop f2, Rook f3. Black's passed pawn, combined with the rook invasion and some weakness of the c5 pawn, led to White's loss in the end. We will give the end of this game in the following. A mysterious move that places the rook on a closed line, which can only become open if the opponent wishes to do so. If he does not do so, the position of our rook is useless. Such a move should not be made without clearly realizing that we are going to make a sacrifice in the power of the piece. We make this sacrifice to prevent the enemy's free pawn advance, or at least to hinder this advance. However, if we find that the freeing move that the opponent is trying to make is imaginary, not actually leading to release, then it would be highly uneconomical to make the sacrifice in question. In the Blackburn-Nimzowitsch game, which we talked about earlier, diagram 32. The difference between real and imaginary release moves is striking. The considered game allows us to identify the difference between the real and imaginary release moves. Also of interest is the way in which Black prevented the advance of d3, d4, and then g4, g5. But the most important conclusion for us is the following. There are no absolute freeing moves at all. In case of insufficient development, the release always turns out to be imaginary. And, conversely, a move that does not appear to be releasing at all can, with an excess of tempo, lead to a very free game. For example, let's consider the following provision. White undoubtedly has a significant tempo advantage, and therefore Black's attempt to free himself with f7, f5 only leads to a premature exposure of his underdeveloped position. For example, f5, e takes f, g takes f followed by nh5 and f2, f4, and a strong attack. With a weak development of Black, the release move f7 f5 only leads to a premature opening of the position and its weakening. This circumstance was unknown to the pseudo-classical school. It knew only absolute freeing moves. The move f7 f5, with white pawns e4, d5 against black pawns d6, e5, seemed to it so, and it considered it extremely useful in 80% of cases. The piece of 60% seems more likely to us. For even after the passive defensive move f2 f3, the strength of the e5 and f5 pawns should not be exaggerated. Unexpectedly, we were faced with the main position of limitation of mobility, which we will proceed to consider. 4. How to limit the mobility of enemy pawns in case of pawn superiority. Fight against numerical superiority in the center. Qualitative superiority. Suppose black has a pawn advantage, say the a5 pawns, b5 against a3, or the e5 pawns, f5 against f3. They threaten to form a passed pawn or, in the second case, to attack the castling position by creating a wedge f5 f4 followed by rf8, f5 h5, and so on. The idea of limiting the mobility of such pawns is to neutralize the opponent's extra pawn by pressing on an open lane using two different blocking squares. In the position, if there are other pieces, the one who has pawn superiority has two threats. The first is to advance e5 e4. The second is to form a wedge f5 f4 due to a possible diversion of rf8, f5 g5, h5, and, let's say, a simultaneous desire to establish the knight on e3. What is the idea behind mobility restriction? Yes, in the case of e5 e4, blocking pawns with f3 f4 followed by b3. If f5 f4 follows, then block on the e4 square with n4. Hence the knight, thanks to its attack radius, complicates the sabotage mentioned above. So, the main idea of limiting mobility is to use an open line in connection with the double possibility of blockade. The central pawns that create a pawn advantage should not be allowed to advance too far. In this case, the threat of wedge formation can be very unpleasant. For example, in the position, if there are a significant number of pieces on both sides, the move f4 f3 threatens to block the communication line between the points g2 and h2 on the one hand, and the other points on the second rank on the other. For example, a white rook with a2 could no longer protect the squares g2 and h2. If the game were equal in other respects, then with this position of the pawns, black's attack would become very strong. Hence the need to fix the opponent's pawns already on the fourth rank. So, the f3 pawn against the e5, f5 pawns. The concept of qualitative superiority is easy to grasp for anyone who has become familiar with our pawn chain. The pawns of the flank on which the movement towards the base of the enemy pawn chain takes place should be considered qualitatively stronger. Thus, in the position, white has qualitative pawn superiority on the king side, and black has queenside supremacy. 5. Various forms of mobility restriction. A. Wrestling against the moving central pawn. B. Struggle against qualitative pawn superiority. C. Limitation of mobility of compact doubled pawns. D. My special opening variation, imbued with the tendency to limit mobility. A. Moving central pawn. After the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, d6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4, bishop d7. The following position may arise. The white e4 pawn against the black pawns d6, and f7 or d4 against e6, c6. Black restricts the mobility of the e4 pawn by playing on the e-file, i.e. by nf6, b7, short castling, re8, bf8. Another way to deprive the e4 pawn of mobility is a more passive placement d6, f6. Such a situation, say, d4 versus c6. e6 is typical. I call it saw. When the central pawn tries to move forward, black's pawn mechanism will show its sharp teeth. The sequence of maneuvers directed against the moving pawn center is usually as follows. 1. Passive position of the saw. 2. More aggressive restriction of mobility by pressing on the open line with the rook. 3. The desire to make the central pawn backward or isolated. 4. Mechanically stopping the pawn by blocking. 5. Mastering a pawn. The motto of a chess player fighting against a moving pawn center should be: first limit mobility, then block, and finally destroy. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, e takes d, knight takes d4. The next game is only superficially complex in its motives, but in reality its content consists in the fight against the e4 pawn. d4, knight f6, c4, d6, knight f3, knight bd7, knight c3, e5, e4, bishop e7, bishop d3, short castling, e takes d. If rook e8 then d5 and black has a cramped position, for example, knight c5, bishop e3, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, knight d7, b4, a5, a3 and so on. Knight takes d4, rook e8, b3, knight e5, bishop c2, a6. The goal of black's advancement on the queen side soon becomes clear. Bishop b2, bishop d7, h3, bishop f8, f4, knight g6, queen f3, c6, rook ae1, b5. Now it's clear. Black is operating against the e4 pawn. At the same time, he is trying to remove the c4 pawn, which makes the a6 pawn backward. Queen d3, queen c7, king h1, rook at 8, bishop b1, b4. Here we are dealing with a somewhat unusual, however, formation of a pawn chain. The links in this chain are the b3 pawn and c4 pawn against the b4 pawn and knight c5. And why shouldn't the piece, as an exception, play the role of the missing link in the pawn chain? The plan is to maneuver bc8 and f6, d7 c5 followed by a6, a5, a4 and attack against the chain base, the b3 pawn. Thus, b5 b4 transfers the attack from the c4 pawn to the b3 pawn. Knight d1, bishop c8, queen f3, knight d7, knight f5, knight c5, g4, a mistake, as the f4 pawn is not sufficiently defended for a short time. This short time, however, is enough for black to break through white's position in the center. Knight e6, queen g3, bishop b7, h4, d5, e5, c5, c takes d, rook takes d5, king g1. If bishop e4 then, rook takes d1, rook d2, knight f3, queen c6, rook f3, queen takes f3. The whites surrendered. The same theme was illustrated by my games against Teichmann and Blackburn. Now we will refresh our memory of the game against Teichmann. We watched the game against Blackburn earlier. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight bd7. It complicates development, but retains the center. Some critics, considering such moves unesthetic, reveal only spoiled taste. Bishop c4, bishop e7, short castling, queen e2, c6. Black creates a kind of pawn advantage in the center, but the initiative still belongs to white. A4. The closed nature of the position allows you to make moves with pawns in the opening. Queen c7, bishop b3, a6. In order to be able to play with the c6 pawn on occasion, the b5 square is taken away from the c3 knight. h3, e takes d. Surrendering the center is not an inconsistency here. Black attached only temporary importance to holding it. Knight takes d4. Rook e8. Siege strategy. Bishop f4. Bishop f8. f3. Knight c5. Those who carefully studied our material were probably waiting for the occupation of the outpost with n5, but black wants to exchange first in order to get more freedom of action. This technique can be recommended in cramped positions. Bishop a2. Knight e6. Bishop takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Queen d2. Rook at 8. Rook f1. Bishop c8. Rook at 1. Knight d7. Now, after a harmonious development, which was hampered by the lack of space, black occupies the e5 outpost. Knight f5. Knight e5. From here, the knight dominates the position. The attack range is large. If white had subsequently tried to drive the knight away with f3, f4, he would have weakened the e4 pawn by doing so. Knight d4. f6. The e4 pawn becomes more and more paralyzed. King h1. Queen f7. Queen f2. Queen g6. b3. Knight f7. Preparing f6, f5. The student may ask, what did the e5 knight do in the end? Enough, because the whites had no opportunity to do anything. King h2. Rook e7. Knight to 2. f5, destroying the paralyzed e4 pawn. Knight g3. F takes e2. Hasty. It was right at first. Rook to 8, for example. E takes f. Bishop takes f5. Knight takes f5. Queen takes f5. Bishop g3. Rook takes e1. Rook takes e1. Rook takes e1. Queen takes e1. Queen takes c2. Knight c takes e4. With f takes e, an isolated e4 pawn would be very weak. d5. Knight c5. Rook to 8. Knight d3. Rook takes e1. Black achieved only an equal game. Move. Knight d6 would have given white the e5 point. Bishop e5. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Rook takes e1. Rook takes e1. Queen takes e1. Queen e6. Queen takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Bishop e3. This good move paralyzes black's pawn advantage on the queen side. Black should therefore have been content with a draw. They wanted to achieve more and lost. Bishop d6. f4. King f8. King g1. g6. King f2. h5. Knight c5. Bishop c8. a5. Knight h6. b4. King f7. c3. Knight g8. Knight f5 would give a draw. King f3. Knight f6. Bishop d4. Bishop takes c5. Bishop takes c5. Bishop e6. Bishop d4. Knight e4. Knight e2. But not. Knight takes e4. D takes e. King takes e4 due to. Bishop d5 followed by bxg2. Bishop f5. Nothing can be done. Since white on the queen side paralyzed 4 black pawns with 3 pawns, he has an extra pawn on the king side. g4. H takes g. H takes g. Knight d2. It was better not to embark on adventures with the bishop and keep him at home, playing at least. Bishop d7. King g3. Bishop c2. Knight g1. King e6. King h4. Bishop d1. Knight h3. Knight e4. f5, a clever realization of an advantage. G takes f. If king f7 then. F takes g. King takes g6. Knight f4, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Knight f4. King f7. g5. Bishop g4. g6. King e7. g7. King f7. Knight g6, and in view of the irresistible threat of n7 and g8 equals q, black resigned. B. Struggle against qualitative pawn superiority. Take a good look at the position. Now let's move the knight from f6 to c5. In this case, we would see a typical example of limiting the mobility of a qualitative pawn superiority. On. Knight takes c5 would have followed. B takes c, and the advance of the white pawns is mechanically stalled. If a3 to continue b4, then a4, b4, knight b3, and this strong position of the knight to some extent compensates for the possible advance of c4, c5. The mobility of white's kingside pawns is somewhat limited. h3 should be h4, g4, knight g3. It is necessary to realize this simultaneously passive and active activity of the rook pawn, for it is on this activity that the operation tending to limit mobility is based. The move h5, h4, or a5. a4 should always follow in response to h2, h3, or a2, a3. Another typical case reveals the following ending. In the end, it is impossible to interfere with the maneuver qg3, h2, h4, g4, g5. Black must inevitably play f7, f6, and thus white's advance, after gx-f6 and gx-f6, will weaken the base of the opponent's pawn chain. It will be extremely dangerous to attack black's king. Therefore, the correct game plan is included in preventing the advance of h2, h4, and g4, g5 until the king can be taken away. Knight h7, knight f3, queen e7, queen g3, rook f8, h4, f6, rook a1. White also has weaknesses. Queen b7, rook f1, king f7, rook e2. If g5 then, h takes g, h takes g, king e7 with a passable game, passable game, passable game. Rook h8, a mysterious move. King g2, knight f8, g5, h takes g, h takes g, knight d7, g takes f, 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 f. White's attack can be considered a failure, since after g takes f, g takes f, queen g6, king e7, queen g7, king d6. Black would have had an excellent position. G takes f, knight h4, rook a g8, knight g6, rook h5, king f2, knight f8, rook g1, rook g5 with black's advantage. In addition to the dynamic weakness of doubled pawns, we should dwell on two more points. 1. A locked bishop. 2. Lack of space and the associated difficulties of protection. The bad bishop on c8. He is a prisoner in his own camp. We illustrate the first case with this proposition, which arises from the Dutch defense with colors reversed, meaning birds opening, and the two beginnings of the games. f4, d5, knight f3, c5, d3, somewhat unusual. Knight c6, knight c3, bishop g4, g3, bishop takes f3, e takes f, e6, bishop g2, f5, short castling, d4, delightful game. Bishop g2 is now locked. Weakness on e6 is easily defensible. Knight b1, b5, a4, b4, knight d2, knight a5, queen e2, king f7, rook e1, queen d7, knight c4, knight takes c4, d takes c, knight f6, and black has the initiative. e3, e5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, bishop b4, bishop e2, bishop e2, bishop e2. The sequel deserved attention. d4, e takes d, e takes d, d5, bishop e2 with equal play. Short castling, rook e8, a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c, d6, and the whites in the whole game could not find a proper use for the bishop c1. The second case explains the following two positions in the absence of the c7 pawn. Black would have had the opportunity to move, but now, due to the threat of bb7, he is half-trapped. A knight blocking doubled pawns paralyzes the opponent's game. In the position, we see a blocking knight, the effect of which is incredibly great with doubled pawns. Black's pawn superiority on the queen side is not only illusory, but each of the pawns is still in mortal danger. Under such circumstances, a pawn superiority on the king side easily decides the game in favor of white. If both sides had more rooks, white on a4, black on b6 or d8, then black's position is lost in this case as well. From this, it is clear to what extent the blockade of compact doubled pawns paralyzes the opponent's play. D. My special version, which is aimed at limiting mobility. We are talking about the next start of the game. c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and now e4. Already in 1924, after the f4, c5, e4, knight c6, d3, g6 proposed by analyst Krauss, c4 with this move, he saw the idea as a significant limitation of the mobility of enemy forces. To this move, I made the following note. In view of the fact that with this move, c4, white does not at all hope to prevent the advance of d7, d5, or even to prevent it, it needs special explanation. Black aims to advance e7, e6, and d7, d5. Having done so, they will try to strengthen their position on the queen side, playing, for example, in the case of nd4 to start pressing on the c-pawn on the c2 pawn after nxd4 cd. It is this development of the game that becomes impossible during the move c4. The whole on d4 is of no significant importance. If I ask where I got the courage at that time, for it takes moral courage to make a move or try to carry out a plan that is completely contrary to tradition, I must refer to an intensive study of the blockade problem. I tried to find different reflections of this principle, and therefore, for example, in 1926 in Dresden, after the moves e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, I took a chance to play e5, which attracted general attention. My special opening variation, c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, e4 is only a further step on this path. In particular, the well-known Danish theorist Dr. Krauss, studying the issue of the simultaneous use of both moves in the opening, c2, c4, and e2, e4, quite independently came to partially similar results. Now we will cite a few games. This part illustrates the preventive effect of the pieces and the idea of general mobility. c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, c takes d, Knight takes d5. e4, a novelty proposed by me, in which the d2 pawn goes to the backward pawn in order to achieve other benefits. Knight b4 should have been preferred. Knight takes c3. B takes c. g6. Bishop c4. e6. Immediate exploitation of the weakness on d3 was not possible here. For example, knight d3, king e2, knight f4, king f1 with the d2 d4 threat. Or knight takes c1, rook takes c1, knight c6, bishop b5, bishop d7, bishop takes c6 followed by d2 d4, and a better endgame for white. Game for white. Game for white. Game for white. Game for white. Short castling. Knight 8 c6. It was better, perhaps, a6, but even in this case, white by means of a3, knight 4 c6, d3 followed by bc1, e3 getting a good game. d3, knight d4, threatened by a2, a3, knight takes d4, c takes d, knight e2. White is now in a very good position. The weakness of the d3 point is covered by the black pawn. The overall mobility of the kingside pawns, f2, f4, is very high, and finally, which is very important, the bishop c4, which does not seem to take an active part in the game, has a significant warning effect. It counteracts the move e6, e5, a6. To protect against a threat, such as a5, bishop b5, bishop d7, knight takes d4, knight g3, bishop d6, f4, 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 f4. It was very strong. Queen g4, for example. Short castling. Bishop g5, bishop e7, bishop h6, bishop f6, bishop takes g7, bishop takes g7, knight h5. Or short castling. Bishop g5, e5, queen h4 followed by a sacrifice on g7, ing3, h5, g7, 5g7, 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 5. The best answer to queen g4 would be queen f6, but after f4, and in this case, white has a significant advantage. A less sharp continuation, chosen by white, gives the opponent the opportunity to approximately equalize the game. Short castling. Queen f3, f3, f3. It is no longer possible to switch to a direct mating attack. For example, e5, bishop c7, queen g4, king h8, knight h5, rook g8, rook f3, f5, e takes f, g takes f, queen h4, rook g6, rook h3, queen e7, and black threatens to finally strengthen his position with bc8, d7, and ra8, g8. King h8, bishop d2, f5, rook ae1, knight c6. Black defended well, but white has another trump card, the e line. Rook e2, queen c7. This is not good. In cramped positions, one should not reduce the mobility of one's pieces, even to a very small extent. Black should have left himself the opportunity to play qd8, f6 after ef, after which his position would have been better than in the game. E takes f, e takes f, knight h1. The knight undertakes a long journey, the goal of which is the g5 point, to support the action of the c4 bishop as well as the rook on the open e file. Bishop d7, knight f2, rook ae8, rook f1, Rook takes e2. Rook takes e2. Knight d8. Move. Rook e8 is refuted by means of Queen d5. Knight h3. Bishop c6. Now it's the turn. Rook e8 would already entail all sorts of combinational tricks, for example, Queen h5. But stronger. Queen d5, after which he was forced to Rook f8, then King f1, Bishop c6, or Bishop c5, b4. Queen takes d4, 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 d. Rook takes e2, Knight g5, h6. Better. Rook takes g2, King takes g2, Bishop c6, King g1, g6 as pointed out by Dusko Bzukov, Bachka Palamka, in the magazine Matt Read More. Queen h6 threatens ba5, Queen e7. Queen g6, h takes g, Queen h5, Queen h5, Queen h5, Queen h5, Queen h5, Queen h5, g6, Queen h4, King g7. Queen f2. Black's castling position is still too well defended, so White is trying to cause a regrouping of the enemy forces. Bishop c5, or Queen b6, b4 and bc3. b4, Bishop b6, Queen h for the task idea of returning the piece. It was good, however, and Queen e1, for example, Bishop e4, Knight f2 with winning a pawn, by next 4, and so on. Rook e8. On. Rook f6 would have followed. Knight g5, h6, Knight h7 with an immediate win. Rook e5, Knight f7. If h6, then g4 with the strongest attack. F takes g. Or g5, F takes g with the threat of checkmate. f5, Queen takes e5, f6, Queen takes f6, Queen takes h6, 6, 6, 6. After a move in the game, White gracefully forces a win. Bishop takes f7, Queen takes f7. On the Rook takes e5 would have followed. F takes e, Queen takes f7, Knight g5, Queen g8, e6, Bishop d5, Queen f4 with easy winnings. Knight g5, Queen g8, Rook takes e8, Bishop takes e8, Queen e1. A wonderful position. Black's position is lost. Despite the small number of attacking pieces, there is a mating attack in the air, which cannot be repelled in any way. The options that arise are very beautiful. Bishop c6. In the case of King f8 wins. Queen e5. Bishop d8, even better. If Queen takes a2, then Queen f6, King g8. Or Bishop f7, Knight takes f7 followed by qxb6. Knight e6, Knight e6, Knight e6, Knight e6, King e7, Queen c5, King d7, Knight f8, Queen e7, King h8. If King h6 then, I understand. Knight e6. b5 tightens the noose. Queen g7, despair. If a takes b then, knight e6, h5, queen f6, king h7, knight g5, king h6, bishop b4 leads to checkmate. Queen takes g7, king takes g7, b takes c, and white won. This part illustrates the limitation of the mobility of compact doubled pawns. Knight f3, d5, b3, c5, e3, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e5, bishop b5, queen d6, e4, 4, 4, 4. We have before us a curious case. We talked about it earlier, see diagram 41, when you should not create doubled pawns on your opponent immediately, but should achieve it indirectly. The fact is that after bishop takes c6, b takes c, it would be impossible to force a stubborn opponent to weaken the center with d5, d4, e.g., or e4, knight f6, and so on. d4, knight a3, f6. Move na3, made with a threat, e.g., knight f6, knight c4, queen c7, bishop takes c6, b takes c, and doubled pawns are clearly weak. Knight c4, queen d7, queen h5. This stroke of the queen is intended to make it difficult for the opponent to rook long and not short, as it may seem at first glance. g6, queen f3, queen c7. But not long castling, since this will be followed by knight a5, after which the defensive move, knight g7, impossible due to queen takes f6. Queen g4. As a result of the ultramodern maneuver, the queen gained a good observation post. King f7. It threatened, for example, knight h6, queen e6, king d8, bishop takes c6, and the goal is achieved. Black has weakened doubled pawns. f4, h5, queen f3, e takes f, bishop takes c6, b takes c, d, 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 bx c6 at the proper moment, because black cannot now capture the bishop with his queen, for example. Queen takes c6, queen takes f4, rook e8, short castling, queen takes e4. If rook takes e4, then knight e5, queen c7, and white wins. Queen e7, knight d6, followed by next 8. At last, white has achieved his goal at the cost of a pawn, but this is of secondary importance. Short castling. g5. Black's position can be shattered. To do this, you need 3 pawn moves: c2, c3, e4, e5, and b3, b4. c3. Rook d8. This rook is thus lucky tied to the d4 pawn. Rook ae1, knight e7, e5, knight f5, c takes d, knight takes d4. If c takes d, then e takes f, king takes f6, queen e4, and the move, knight g3, impossible due to bishop takes d4. Queen e4, bishop e7. On the f5 would have followed queen b1, a modernist retreat fraught with the threat of attack, for example, for king e6 to protect the f5 pawn. Queen d3 followed by nd6, and a strong attacking position. h4. Now black's position collapses like a house of cards. Queen d7. E takes f. Bishop takes f6. H takes g. Black resigned. After h takes g. Bishop g7. Knight e5. Bishop takes e5. Queen takes e5. The position of the black king is downright touching in its helplessness. d4. Knight f6. c4. e6. Knight c3. Bishop b4. e3. Black wants to double his opponent's pawns only at the right moment. See the previous game. Short castling. Bishop d3. c5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Short castling. Bishop takes c3. b takes c. d6. The current situation with doubled pawns is still favorable for black to some, very small, extent. Knight d2. If advancing the d4 pawn now was achieved by e4, e5, d5, knight a5, then this would be a small success, because the c-pawn should be on c7 in this case. See the previous analysis of compact doubled pawns. b6. And d2. Good plan. On the e5, d5, knight a5 will be followed by knight b3 with the exchange of the attacking knight a5. Knight b3. There was no need to hurry with this move. Beforehand, it was necessary to play f4 if then, e5 then, f takes e, d takes e, d5, knight a5, knight b3, knight b7, e4, knight e8, and the weak c4, which can also be attacked from the a6 square, would be protected by qe2, while the open f-file, along with the advance of a2, a4, a5, would be the basis for white's further operations. In this case, the game would be approximately equal. e5, f4. 4 on the d5 would have followed. e4, for example. Bishop e2, knight e5, 5, or d takes c, e takes d with the advantage of black. e4. It was possible. Queen e7 if then. F takes e, d takes e, d5 then. Knight d8, e4. Knight e8, and black would take a solid defensive position with nd6 and f7 f6. Bishop e2. Queen d7. Black is aware of the qualitative superiority of white's kingside pawns. With the move in the game, they begin a complex game to limit the movement of these pawns. For example, knight e8, g4, or f5, queen g5, f5, d takes c. The bad bishop c1, as well as other pieces, is of little use for concentrating an attack on the g line. D takes c, queen d5, queen takes d5, c takes d, knight e7, rook d1, knight d6, and white's position is somewhat worse. h3, knight e7, queen e1. Black also had an advantage in bishop d2 to threaten bd2, e1, h4 on occasion. Knight f5, queen e1. Best of all, there was a threat of ing3 with the exchange of the bishop, after which the c4 pawn became especially weak. g6 if now, g4, knight g7, queen h4 then, Knight F8 and the movement of white's pawns is stalled because black's next move is f7 f5. Thus, we constantly see the same picture. The presence of doubled c3 and c4 pawns restricts the mobility of the white pieces and makes it much more difficult for them to participate in the kingside attack. h5. Bishop d2, 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 d2 cannot be played. Queen h4. Knight f5. Queen g5 d2. Knight h7. Queen takes h5. Knight g3. Queen f5. The queen is aiming for h7, where his position will be excellent, because black is already threatening to paralyze the enemy's pawns with h5 h4. The whole maneuver qd8, d7 f5 h7 is undoubtedly a curious design. King h2, queen h7, a4, knight f5, g3, and f5 played, with a threat, for example, bishop c1, knight g4, h takes g, h takes g, king g1, g3, and so on. a5. It is easy to reconcile with the presence of the backward b6 pawn here. Rook g1, knight h6, bishop f1, bishop d7, bishop c1, rook ac8. Black is trying to trigger the move d4 d5 so that he can operate on the king side without interference. d5, otherwise b6 would follow, and the move d4 d5 would still have to be made. King h8, knight d2, rook g8. Now the attack begins. So qd7, f5 h7 was an attacking maneuver? Yes and no. No, because his idea was only to limit the mobility of white pawns. Yes, for the limitation of mobility is the logical prerequisite of attack. Every immobile complex tends to become a weakness and sooner or later becomes an object of attack. Bishop g2, g5, knight f1, rook g7, rook a2, knight f5, bishop h1. White skillfully attracted all reserves to the defense. Rook cg8, queen d1, g takes f. Black opens the g line for himself and the e line for the opponent. Therefore, the move required deep reflection. E takes f, bishop c8, queen b3, bishop a6, rook e2. White takes advantage of the opportunity. The e-pawn now needs to be defended. When playing passively, for example, bishop d2, a beautiful combination would follow. Rook g6, bishop e1, knight g4, h takes g, h takes g, king g2, bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, and now, quiet running. e3, after which checkmate can be avoided only. Knight takes e3, but in this case, however, the queen is lost. Knight h4, rook e3, 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 e3. Here I waited for the move. Knight d2 for the weakness of the important e4 pawn, as mentioned above, was white's only counter chance. This would have been followed by a spectacular combination with the queen's sacrifice. Bishop c8, knight takes e4, queen f5, knight f2, queen takes h3, knight takes h3, knight g4. The subtlety of the combination lies, in particular, in the fact that the 32nd and 33rd moves cannot be rearranged. For example, knight d2, queen f5, queen d1, bishop c8, queen f1, and with white, everything is protected. While bishop c8, queen d1 move, bishop takes h3 blows up white's position. King takes h3, queen f5, and so on. Bishop c8, queen c2, bishop takes h3, bishop takes e4, On. King takes h3. Queen f5. King h2 mate would have followed in 3 moves. 3 moves. 3 moves. 3 moves. 3 moves. Bishop f5 the best part, because now there is no defense against the move h5 h4. The absence of the h3 pawn makes white's position hopeless. Bishop takes f5. Knight takes f5. Rook e2. h4. Rook gg2. H takes g. King g1. Queen h3. Knight e3. Knight h4. King f1. Rook e8 exact final move. Threatens. Rook e8 if. King e1 then black even checkmates with. Knight f3. King f1. Queen h1 and so on, the whites surrendered. One of the most beautiful games for the blockade I have ever played. Friends, we have completed a deep dive into the difficult topic of doubled pawns and the art of limiting mobility. We have seen that chess is not just a set of static rules, but a subtle play of dynamics and psychology. Sometimes the weakest structure turns into a granite foundation, and the activity of the opponent becomes his own trap. I hope that the principles that we have dissected today will become the right tool for you in your own games. Don't forget, true mastery comes not from memorizing schemes, but from understanding the secret life of each pawn on the board. In the next installment, we move on to 2 cardinal topics: the isolated queen's pawn and the power of 2 bishops. We'll look at why an isolated pawn is both a formidable dynamic resource and a heavy endgame burden, and whether 2 bishops are really a scary weapon in the hands of a connoisseur, or if it's just another kind of weapon that requires a precise understanding of its place on the board. Thank you for your attention, practice, analyze, and see you in the next issue, where we will continue to dissect the basics of positional play.